Welcome, everyone. I'm Brian Laube. I'm welcome to my presentation on temporary tables. I will be discussing the different types of temporary tables in DB2 and some examples of how to effectively use them in different SQL coding situations. And importantly, and the whole reason for this presentation, I'll go over some important lessons I've had about using temporary tables, some experiences I've had. So the agenda is right here. We'll just go over a little introduction, then I'll go over the two main types of temporary tables. Well, the two only types, really. The declared global temporary table and the created global temporary table. I'll also go over some real-life examples of the misuse of a DGT versus a CGT. Then I'll go over what I consider to be the appropriate use cases for the two types of temporary tables. And then I'll provide a simple example of some SQL PL using DGT and CGT and show you how it worked there. And then at the end, I'll go over some other temporary concepts in DB2 because I feel they're kind of related. Okay. By the way, if anyone has a question during the presentation, I'll take questions at the end, of course, but you can raise your hand in the middle, and I'll try to pay attention to you. A temporary table, it's a concept available in most RDMSs, of course. It's a table to keep data for the duration of some application process. And it's temporary because the data is basically private and only available to the current application user. Many types of end users can use a temporary table. It can range from ad hoc dynamic query end users like yourself or me or some developer, up to real application programs, native SQL stored procedures, COBOL, well, SAS or whatever. And of course, yes, you'll see temporary tables are used in both static and dynamic SQL. There's two types of temporary tables again. I'll probably say this a bunch. Declared DGT, declared global temporary table. They're declared by anyone. They're declared in the moment it needed, and then used, and then they disappear and are forgotten by DB2. And a created temporary table is created in advance. It's just used, but it's only used at the moment it's needed. The definition is known by DB2 in advance. Anyway, but I'll go over that again. Why would you use a temporary table? What's it for? It's a place to store data relevant to your application needs, whether you're a real application or some end user. It's a place to store data together and keep it for a short while. And it helps give you some SQL coding options. In a sense, by breaking big SQL into multiple smaller SQL, referencing a temporary table, I find you can break down a complex coding requirement or reporting requirement into something easier to understand and maintain. It can often make your SQL script easier to understand as opposed to trying to do everything in one giant select statement with a whole bunch of cases. And actually using temporary tables and having multiple SQL steps allows you to have some obvious influence over the access path, right? Because you'll go into the temporary table first and you can more easily predict like usually when I code a SQL statement, I can anticipate what index is going to be used or should be used. And especially if it's a smaller one, right? So using temporary tables in a script of SQL can help reduce complexity. Okay. Oops. And then I'll go over this a little more later, but an example of a use of a temporary table is like a high volume online transaction might need to hold working data in a temporary table for a short time. It might help make the transaction logic simpler, or just maybe necessary for the application logic of this transaction to use a temporary table to gather all data together. Or else a low volume batch reporting application might have complex reporting requirements, which are more easily implemented by using a temporary table. And, well, of course, the other classic user, in my sense, or what I'm thinking, is end users, like people who are writing ad hoc SQL or queries against a database, like a DBA or developer or someone in support. You may have some totally dynamic and ad hoc complex query requirement where a temporary table provides a simple way for you to hold your data together. Again, it's like another reporting, but instead of like a reporting application, it's just like I'm reporting for myself. And I've used temporary tables in Spoofy, Batch, DS and Db2, or workstation tools like Data Studio, and to hold old data and make very complex, almost procedural queries to a series of tables. And I find, so if I'm using some temporary table and writing like a long script of several SQL statements, I'm able to produce fairly sophisticated reports for my own needs about the catalog or the real-time stats or whatever I'm gathering, just using SQL. In fact, I found something interesting I guess I could point out is I often develop my SQL scripts in Data Studio. I don't know if you use Data Studio with SQL for Z. I still, even though it's kind of being sunsetted in the distant future, it's still my favorite tool for developing SQL for the Z platform. And it is like a rather large product to install. It's a big bloated tool. I really like the Smart Insert. Anyway, but I developed my SQL scripts in Data Studio, and I've noticed that my SQL scripts in Data Studio using temporary tables, I had like last week or 2 weeks ago, I had like about 10 SQL statements in a row using a temporary table and inserting and using merge to update and all this fun thing. And it took almost 1 elapsed minute in Data Studio, but when I ran it in batch I used TIAUL, the batch unload program, and it took like a second. So Data Studio really has some, even though it has this great formatting and presentation capability for developing your SQL, the back and forth from your tool to your mainframe and sending the data back and forth was remarkably expensive. But that's just like an ad hoc end user, right? So I can deal with the Data Studio or put it in batch. Anyway, that's something I recently learned. So, and of course, the IBM Knowledge Center provides excellent documentation. I feel it's pretty good documentation on how to use it. It's very good reference information. It's not always the best on explaining why you would use it or in what scenarios, but it's very good reference. But that's what's in the name. It's the Knowledge Center. Okay. So and beyond the declared temporary table and the created temporary table, I'm going to just like mention at the end some other temporary table concepts just to differentiate from other ones. So I'll go over, just remind everyone about common table expressions and derived tables, which I think you probably know. Okay. So here, let me just get a few more details about the created global temporary tables. As always, like the best reference, as I said, is in the Knowledge Center. And I put a link in the notes, but you should be able to find it. The CGT, it's created once, often by the DBA, in advance, and then others, usually applications, can use it. So you need some authorization to create a CGT, and there you will see a row in systables after the CGTT is created. The table type will be G. The table type, not to be confused with the table space type, which would be a PVG. And then in the systables, the card F and end pages will default to -1. I suppose you could zap these values to potentially influence any future optimizer decisions, but I've never had real need to do that. So again, like all temporary tables, each application has its own instance of a created temporary table while it's using. The data is to the user of the instance of the CGT. So in your application, it could be Data Studio or Batch or Spoofy or COBOL, but you just basically insert into the table, the temporary table, the pre-created temporary table. And as soon as you begin the insert, it's available. It exists for you, and that data exists for you alone. So it exists when you use it by using open, select, delete, or insert. Most likely you begin by using insert to stuff data into it. Oh, notice there's no update. Well, you'll see that again, but only limited SQL actions. The instance of the temporary table will exist until the application process ends or the remote server connection terminates or the unit of work completes. Rollback commit. And so with commit, DB2 will delete the instance of the temporary table unless it is referenced in an open cursor that's defined with hold. Sometimes you could like return the cursor to the calling program. So again, each application has its own version of the CGT and the data private to them. It's defined in advance, and it's kind of like any other table. If you have one like created temporary table created for your application, as you go up through dev, test, and accept, like the structure could change over time. So you may need to be dropping and creating it and have some change control over it. But generally, if it would be the same name, you would assume it's the same layout in dev and test and prod. Here's some other important details that it's all in the documentation, but these are things I thought to highlight. So there's no locking performed. There's no locking performed on the CGT because it's private to you. You can't use merge with it. And there's no update allowed either. I suppose I have this. So no merge, no update. You can use delete, but without a where clause. So you can only, if you have a need, you can only empty it. Select is used to query the CGT, or you open a cursor. There's no indexes allowed. And if you are truly finished with your CGT and no application programmer or end user uses it anymore, then it must be dropped to remove from the catalog. So you use drop table, of course. it knows it doesn't matter. It's a CGT as opposed to a regular table. Okay, so that's enough of the details about the created temporary tables. So, and here's a few words about declared temporary tables, just to drive home the point. As always, the best reference is in the Knowledge Center. I have the link in the notes here. The DGTT is defined or declared as it is needed by an application or end user. You don't need any special authorization to use a DGT. It's not stored in the Db2 catalog. It's not persistent at all. It cannot be shared. You declare and then you use it. If some other process or person wants to use the same DGTT with the same name, perhaps because they're running the same script, that's allowed and that's possible, but they have to declare it as well and then use it themselves. So, because it's their own DGTT. So, and within your SQL, your subsequent references to it must use session as the schema or creator. So, and I think that the schema of session, it's a reminder to you, like the user of the DGT, that it's only used in this session. It's like the session.dgtt. And then when the application process terminates, this type of temporary table is also implicitly dropped. So, interestingly, a DGT can have 0 or 1 or many indexes. Interestingly, the by default indexes are being compressed. A DGT allows update and it allows merge. So that's an important difference from created temporary tables. And on commit, the DGT can be auto-emptied. So optionally on commit, you can automatically drop it. Or on commit, the DGT can preserve the rows to carry on to the next commit and only terminate when the thread terminates. It's all in the declare statement, the syntax, these options. And interestingly, a DGT can be logged or not logged as of version 11. And if not logged, then on rollback, it can delete the preserve of the rows. Really, I'll say this again later, but like whether you're going to be logging or not logging your DGT is perhaps you might be over worrying it. So by default, I just go with the default of logging. I would only worry about it if it's a very large amount of data I'm going to be stuffing into it. So but DGT, important things is that they allow indexes and you can update and merge with them. And I guess you can have control deletes with the where clause. So temporary tables use the work database, DB2. You don't really have to worry about it. I haven't had to yet. I haven't noticed any impact to my system about my application usage of temporary tables. I suppose if you have a super high volume or super large amount of data to stuff in, you'll have to really maybe give it a second investigation. But they're using the DB2. So if it's particularly large, you might have to be careful about your impact. And there's some ZParms that control it you might need to review. I find that DGTs are, well, you'll see again later, but they're often used for temporarily storing 0 to many rows. But sometimes you just use them for storing a handful or 1 row. I've even used like a one row, one column table. So, here I'll just this is I'm getting into why I'm doing this presentation. So, at a high level, both types of temporary tables provide a simple temporary table functionality for the end user for SQL needs. And, initially, at first blush, DGT seems much easier than CGT. And some people might even say they're better. But you should always remember this classic DBA phrase, it depends. They're not necessarily better, it depends. So there's no DBA required for DGT. They allow indexes, you can update, you can merge, selective deletes. So what's not to love about DGT? Especially like the no DBA required. It's like a little less hassle for me. When I first started using them years ago, the simplest examples were me sitting at my desk, writing some ad hoc queries that I realized would be helped by using a temporary table. So I made some scripts at my desk and started using them. And then I came to realize that declared temporary tables are pretty useful. They're easy to code. You just declare and use it, and if it turns out you don't even have to drop it, right? At the end, they just disappear. So I can just run it over and over until I perfect it, and it's very easy. And then someone might tell a bunch of his favorite developers about DGT and CGT, and I might accidentally or emphasize how easy it is to use DGT. No need to bother a DBA, and I think it would help them with their ad hoc query requirements, right? So years ago, I kind of told some of my end users about DGT. And then a few years might pass. I continued to use DGT all the time, but just in my personal needs, right? I'm not writing applications. And I'm kind of unaware about how much that developers are using temporary tables in the applications. As far as I know, it's limited or non-existent. It's no one's ever come to me and had questions about it. And it's sometimes I try to teach I try to teach my end users new SQL tricks and techniques, and I wonder how often they actually learn and use new SQL. But it's you got to try showing people. For example, the other things, I'm trying to encourage people to write SQL with the more modern join syntax of inner join and outer join, as opposed to select from table A, comma, B. Apparently, the join syntax is from 1992, but people are still using from the previous SQL standard. It's incredible. Okay. Anyway, so I wonder if people actually learned. But then one day, an exciting and new application is developed in-house, and it's implemented. And then, I'm aware of this application, and it goes to prod, but I wasn't actually involved in any code reviews or anything. It was kind of a fun application. It's futuristic and modern. It's written almost entirely with Db2 native SQL stored procedures. Cool. It's very fun. But then after a few days, we realized that the mainframe resources were going through the roof, and it was obviously this new application. Further investigation quickly led to, it wasn't that hard once we looked closely. It's some new and high-cost SQL procedures. And this application had 100 procedures that it would use to various times, but there were a few at the top that were using a huge amount of CPU. And then I quickly reviewed the top 3 or 5 procedures, looked at the source code, and then I saw the SQL that they put inside these procedures, and I wasn't very happy with them. they're like overly complex, and I'm pretty good at SQL. And I was like, oh my God, I don't really understand your intent here. It's like all these like conditions and joins, and they went on for pages. But okay, that's fine. I also noticed that the reliance on the top 3 or 5 were all using DGT. So each of these high CPU, high resource procedures use a DGT to gather data from various applications. So they declared the temporary table. They ran a big insert to stuff data into the temporary table. And this is where the select portion was hugely complex. And then they rather unnecessarily counted the rows inside the DGT. And then they returned the contents back to the caller. So they didn't really need to count the rows, because after you do the insert, the SQL CA has that information, even in SQL PL. But the person who was writing this didn't really think that. Okay, so that's fine. Apparently the project got going through acceptance with no complaints. They never asked me or another DBA to review the code or the application performance results. In acceptance, the response time, it wasn't a batch application, it was like an online application. So the response time and CPU time were well under a second. It seemed fine, like someone hit enter, their response would come back. But it was close to a second in like real time. And so the math would say, like, if they thought about the math of how many times they would call this procedure during the day, it would add up to something significant. Anyway, so that's basically what happened. It was individually, the response was okay, but it used a fair amount, like a high volume transaction should have a very low CPU cost, not a second. So we need to do something. So, and this is where it became like very apparent, like, well, what are the cons of the DGT? It's an extra SQL statement. It must be executed every time it is needed. So your procedure language has a declare, an extra statement every time. And but the subsequent SQL that references the DGT, they must be dynamically bound at execution time for Db2 optimizer to figure out the optimal access path. So because the SQL statement that references the DGT can't be optimized at create or bind package time if it's COBOL, because the table layout is not known to the optimizer at that time, right? So it's only at execution time that the access path can be determined. So you have to declare the table, extra SQL statement, and then every time you use it, all those SQL statements have to have like an access path decision being made. So together, these two little things add up. And there's like many procedures that use this concept. So that's kind of the con. I do have later I found I do have one COBOL application that uses a DGT. But it was written years ago, and but it only runs once a month. So these these things didn't really matter. It was like batch report. It was probably would have been better served by a CGT in that case, but use a DGT. So in this case, we created a CGT that was exactly the same as the declared temporary table. The procedure was modified to use the CGT instead of the DGT. The application logic did not change at all. Although the SQL could have used some review and modification. That was out of scope for the immediate scope of the issue of trying to reduce the CPU. And switching to the CGT resulted in 96% reduction of CPU time in this one procedure. It went from something quite noticeable to something almost costless. It was such a relief. The other high cost and high volume procedures using DGT were changed to CGT, and the overall CPU for the application went down from like a few hours today to reasonable minutes per day. So So that was it. Like we didn't like review the. I wanted to change the SQL, but too much hassle. But we just switched from DGT to CGT in this procedure, and it was. And so here's an example of one, and you can see the two different times, right? So this is the day, the few days before, just after implementation, and the procedure, this particular one was using like 30 minutes per day. It was using 46,000, issuing 46,000 SQL statements per day. It was being called about 13,000 times a day. So the average cost was 0.13, 0.12. The most expensive was 0.68, whatever. So I guess the most expensive was when the SQL query, it was like a search procedure, was more broad. So you can see like the CPU cost wasn't like huge, but it was just being called so many times. So then we switched on this day, and the average cost dropped tremendously. So, you know, it was like 95% lower. And you can even see here that the volume like of package allocations and the counts of my trace records remained relatively consistent. You can see the SQL counts went down almost by half because we no longer did declare. It was just like insert into CGT and then open the cursor to return it. So yeah, it was a great result. Oh, and this data is coming from my performance database. You probably all have a performance monitor tool, right? So I use Omegamon, and Omegamon has a performance database, and just want to recommend or suggest to everyone, if you don't use it, consider using it in your world, because Omegamon provides a series of tables that you can load trace output into. Basically, I just process my Db2 SMF every morning for yesterday, converts it to a flat file, and then load it into these tables. And the performance database table just has the whole trace record. So it's much easier for me to query the performance database than to run batch trace reports off SMF or whatever. I don't know. I'm all into it now. That's my thing. That was a presentation I did at IDUG a couple years ago. So here, in lesson learned, CGT are well designed for small result sets, well, because no index is allowed. So a small result set is good. They're good for being used over and over again, especially in high volume transactional application, CICS or web or whatever, distributed application. They're easy to use within static programs. The SQL access path will then be fixed because it's not, the optimizer knows in advance. They can't be updated, but typical transactional type users of temporary tables don't really need to update their temporary table contents. They just gather their data, do something, and perhaps pass it on or process it again. And it's predefined. You just use it, and then it exists for you. And as I said earlier, DGT requires an extra SQL statement. So it became more and more clear, like they're great for ad hoc query reporting. They're great for helping you break up large query requests, reporting requests, either for you or for an application, into multiple smaller and easier to understand steps. And they can hold like a large result set or a small, and you can update them, you can merge them, you can put indexes on them, and you can use a unique index to guarantee uniqueness of the rows in the table. You can't do that in a CGT. But usually you would control uniqueness by understanding the SQL that you're using to put the data in. So you should know what you're putting in, right? So if you're worried about unique rows, you should make sure your select to insert controls the type of data. And this too, a DGT, same thing. But in this case, you can have an index to enforce and guarantee it. And of course, my initial reason I love DGTT is they can be used by anyone. Here, I'll just give a little example here of how I used, after this whole debacle, I went back and kind of proved to myself how it works. So here I created a simple temporary table with column names, so CGTT 01, and then I created a SQL procedure, because I'm all into SQL procedures now, and I declared I insert into this CGT some rows from the syscolumns table, and I just put some random function just to make it different, and I stuffed 10 rows into it. So this is meant to be a very simple select to populate the temporary table, and then, I don't know, unnecessarily I count the rows, and then I open the cursor of the CGT to return the data to the caller. So that's like a simple, very simple use of a CGT that anyone can do back at home. And here's an example of the same procedure, or a different procedure using declared temporary table and performing the same logic. But here you see I have to declare the temporary table, and then I declare a cursor, and here then I do the insert, same logic, and then I count the rows unnecessarily, and then I open the cursor to return it. And then, so, you know, some simple examples of using. And so I called the first one 100 times, and I called the DGT one 100 times. And you can see the one using the CGT was 20 times cheaper. So this is meant to simulate, you know, these statistics in these programs just simulate to me like the cost of declaring the table is so much. And then I made, well, you don't need to see the source code for this, but I made a same program, except instead of 10 rows, I'm inserting 999 rows. So this is meant to simulate a slightly more complex use or stuffing of data into the temporary table. And here you can see that so in this case, like the declare and the bind probably at the same cost, but I spent more time inserting into it. So that had more of a cost to my overall application. So in this case, like the procedure with DGT was 4.5 times more CPU. So not the 20 times as in the previous example. So it's just meant a more complex select to populate the temporary table. So just, I guess my point here is that this is meant to emphasize that it depends, the amount of benefit you get or the cost of using one or the other really depends upon the SQL statement that you're using to populate the temporary table, and then how often you reference it. So it's not going to be a fixed rule that they're 4 times faster or 20 times faster. So, but in this case, it was just like a high volume transaction using temporary tables. I think clearly you should use CGT. It's worth bothering the DBA and asking him to create the temporary table in advance. So in static programs, high volume programs, transactions, consider CGT if you need one. And declare to be for low volume, generally reporting. So I'm not going to say there's like a fixed rule, but that's like my general rule now. But it always depends. So now that I'm fully aware of the pros and cons. And you could use a CGT in a low volume monthly reporting if it's a COBOL program or something, and you don't like, that's fine. But the CGT would be static, so you can review the access path with more confidence. So that might be reason to do in a COBOL program for a reporting program. But you can still use a DGT if you just had like a TIAUL script with some DG temporary table usage. That might be good too. And like I said before, they're easy to use, so it can be used by anyone, no special permission. And the whole index thing, just because you can add indexes, you don't have to. I don't know. At first I was all gung-ho and I was unnecessarily creating indexes that I never use. So you have to really think about it. Oh, here you go with indexes. So DGT allow indexes. So why put an index? Well, the unique rows, but you created the SQL, right? So you should have some idea of the likelihood of getting a duplicate row and if that's important to you. And if you know if your insert is not going to create duplicates, then you don't need to create an index to enforce that rule, because you're just going to be dropping the DGT in a second. And but the important thing is you might be creating an index to help later SQL. So for matching. So if the index is not unique, or so this is where you can start thinking, maybe you can explain outside of your application or usage, but actually Visual Data Studio allows you to explain statements that references dynamic temporary tables. You provide the declare and then you do the explain. Works pretty good. And then you can confirm the access path. But really, basically, if the index is, if you believe it's important for your SQL subsequent usage selecting from it, you got to think about it. If it is, that's fine. But often you populate a DGT and then you just end up scanning it later for your subsequent usage. So you don't really need an index. You might, do you even need it for an order by? I guess if it's big, or if people scan it twice, it kind of depends. Or else it could be that you're going to, after you populate it, you want to do a join with an application table. You want to join on like contract or policy ID or something. So, but then you kind of got to think, well, I'm going to need to process every row of the, like I anticipate I'll be processing every row of the temporary table, getting the policy ID, and then going to the policy table, which has an index on policy ID. So you don't need to put a policy ID index on the temporary table, even though you think, well, every other table that has policy ID has a policy ID index. But this temporary table, you know how you're using it. You're stuffing with data, you're going down it, and then you're going to the policy table to get the policy. Now, if you put a policy ID index on your temporary table, the optimizer might make some other decision, start from another table and go to your temporary table. And maybe you want it to consider that. But all my cases have come up like, I know I want to scan it all. So if you really think an index is a good idea, then go ahead. But I often don't put any indexes on my DGT. Oh, and here's a little bit of trivia about logged and not logged. DGT allows you to optionally specify logged and not logged. The default is logged. I don't know. I try not to overthink things. Sometimes I do, but I just leave with the log default. I suppose if it's a huge volume of data you're writing, it might impact performance. But you know, I tried a little bit, and it was hard to measure in my world. So I just left it as it was with the default. But it's something I'm aware of. So I guess like the benefit would I guess when you're doing the inserts, it's getting logged to the log. I did find there's one, my experiment showed there is one little caveat for using logged and not logged. If you get through, if you're inserting data and you do have a unique index and you get a SQL code -803 for violating the unique index constraint, then the DGT will be emptied if it is not logged. If it is logged, it will continue to hold the previous rows. So if you get a minus, if you're halfway through and you get a minus 803 and it's not logged, the table contents is flushed. If it's logged, the previous rows will remain. So that's just like a little bit of trivia that I stumbled across that I thought would be interesting to. It's in the documentation, but you just kind of, it's just reference, it's just documentation. The implication wasn't really obvious to me until I tried it. But I just use logged. And since I was talking about temporary tables, I just wanted to briefly go over these concepts of a derived table and a common table expression to remind them about the power and options available in SQL, not just DB2, but most RDMSs. And in particular, CTEs are my new favorite. Okay, and I use them all the time. They've been available since '82. It's just a way of coding your select. So here, this is what I called a derived table, is when you have like a select, and then you might name it and then you reference it, right? So you have like a select from and then you have a bracket, or whenever you have, you derive a table result, a result set, and you can then name that result as a table and then references. I call that a derived table. It's certainly temporary. It's only for the life of your SQL statement. So that's why it's in my presentation. A common table expression is just the syntax to create a common table expression before your main select. And so there's an example of one. Both derived and CTE provide a temporary table, a temporary holding of data for the life of your SQL statement. And they've been around for a long time. CTE, I've been looked it up, they're syntactically available since version 8. But between derived and CTE, I use CTEs now all the time. Of course, it depends. But when I see too many, I find it confusing to see too many derived tables inside a big, long SQL statement. It gives me a headache. I find if it's a CTE, it's more clear. They're easy to read. They're at the top. They can be referenced multiple times. That's different. Derived tables cannot be referenced multiple times. And a CTE can reference a previous CTE. And you use CTEs in recursive SQL. So all in all, I think CTEs are my go-to SQL concept for helping myself and encouraging others to write more clear SQL statements, perhaps in conjunction with a temporary table. So here's just a quick example of a CTE. So here I have a CTE A and a CTE B, and referencing the other, and then the final select referencing the one SQL statement. It's just a way to produce some data. And then here's, and CTEs are used for recursive SQL, so I just want to digress a bit. So I don't know if you've ever written a recursive SQL. It's a weird concept. It's not weird, but it takes some eating. Anyway, so here's an example of using recursive SQL to read the index columns table in the catalog and to build all the columns in the index as one column in my report. So I list index 1 here is policy number and division number. This is policy number and cert ID, and this is just client ID. I just list them all as comments. So I did this years ago using a CTE with a recursive SQL. So you have to have recursive SQL references to CTE to build up the result recursively. But you can see, this is as clean as I can make it. So not really CTE or temporary tables, but version 12, I switched that whole previous statement to using ListEgg. So I find that ListEgg is a way to use recursive SQL or replace your need for recursive SQL. So once it became obvious to me the purpose of ListEgg, turning result sets sideways, I now use ListEgg instead of writing recursive SQL when I have that requirement. And so I just wanted to mention that to you guys before one thing led to another. Okay, so getting back to temporary tables, what would I like to see in some DGT enhancements? In a DGT, you must declare and then use it. And then after you use it, or when you declare it, you insert into it. Always 2 steps. Declare, then insert, and then select. It would be nice if you could just insert into a new name and have DB2 figure out all the column names based upon the result set of your select. This would save hassle about thinking of the details of all the columns. Because that's one of the problems, is like the result set, column 3 is a sum of something. You got to think, oh, that's going to be decimal 9, whatever, 9,2. So you got to write that declare out. But then if you read the DGT documentation, you can, there's 2 ways to declare a DGT. You can define the column names and the types, or else you can provide a select statement and say that my DGT will hold this select statement. So here's like a very simple example. As select from whatever, with no data. You must put this with no data. So with no data means no data. But wouldn't it be nice if you just remove the word no with data and have like declare the DGT? Oh, oops. Okay. So if you could declare and insert at the same time. So that's my recommendation. And so I made an RFE in AHA to ask IBM to consider it. And it's actually under consideration. So if you use AHA to review RFEs or put your own, I would encourage you to go in AHA and vote for my RFE. I talked to Chris Crone yesterday, and he's aware of my request. He's made some mumblings. I don't know, maybe it'll happen. But an even worse or even better, this concept exists in SQL Server and Oracle and DB2 for LEW. So it's really about time for Z to have it. So, and then I have another thing I'd like to see. Instead of a declared global temporary table, how about a declared global variable? Sometimes I have a need where I want to pick a timestamp, for example, and I want to use this exact same timestamp in many queries in my SQL script. But today, it'd be handy if you could just like declare or set a global temporary variable to be used in your SQL script, and you just reference that working timestamp variable, for example, in all your SQL statements. Otherwise, today I actually put the literal in all my SQL statements, and I do a global changing or replace to run my script over and over. But I thought like having a declared global variable, it's like a logical extension of a temporary table. Simpler, no? The workaround, which I've actually used, is just to declare a temporary table with 1 row and 1 column, insert my timestamp into that 1 row and 1 column, and then in all my subsequent SQL in my script, they can reference that simple DGT. It's a little kludgy. I'd rather have a create or declare a temporary variable. So I made another RFE to IBM to ask for that. And unfortunately, you can't bother voting for that because I was declined. I was very disappointed. So, but anyway, maybe I'll raise it again one day when I get some feedback from them.
You do know there is a global temporary.
You can create variables, but you can't declare them.
You can create them, but the value only gets carried for your unit of work.
But they still have to be created in advance.
Yeah, created, you're going to get access to be able to update them.
And you have to have access to create them.
So that's right.
So like, it's not all my developers have access to create objects in the development schemas. Yeah, for me it's okay. I can create it and then drop it. I'd rather just declare it and have it disappear. So I was thinking about making creating some common variables for the whole system and have anyone use them, then I have to anticipate what they want to use. But yeah, there is. Anyway, but very good. Yes, so there is that subtlety. So, does anyone else have any questions? Okay. You can ask me now if you have more questions, or ask me later. My email is at the end. I often read the listserv. I read often. I reply once in a while. But the listserv is a great place. I encourage everyone to take a look there. I always learn something. And then, yes, and it's important, please fill out your evaluation before the end and hand it to my friend Javier.
Remember that the code is B15.
B15. Your feedback is important. Yeah, I'd appreciate it. I appreciate a good review. I'd appreciate some feedback. I have not presented IDUG before. I've done this not often anyway. Yes, I hope everyone learned something, or I reinforced what you already knew. These are all my RFEs. I've been getting into it. If you're bored, you can vote for them. Okay. Thank you very much. I guess we're pretty much on time.